Hello and welcome to my second video journal. My name is Colin Patrick Barth, and I started this idea to do video journals over a year ago. And the first one went okay, but I had an idea for the second which really kept me from putting it into practice. So I want to talk about the importance of creative failure and the ways in which I think being unable to do what I wanted was instructive from the second time round, or the first stab I made at doing a second one of these. But the original idea was to talk extemporaneously about what it's like to be involved in the creative process of writing an ambitious work of philosophy. In this case, I want to talk in these video journals about writing a work which has a title. I think I talked about it last time, if I remember correctly, but that was over a year ago. But the title is The Constellation of Man. The working title before that was Prometheus Redux. I'm fairly confident the absolute final title is The Constellation of Man, so we'll stick with that. But this is a work that's extremely interesting, and yet it's very, very hard to understand what I'm trying to do with it. And it's 3 volumes, and there's so much work that goes into it. There's really just so much to say, and yet there's no way to encapsulate what I do in any sort of easy way to describe it. I write philosophy and psychology and humanist literature, and I write philosophy in the Nietzschean tradition, and no one knows what that is. So I have to explain what I do in something of a long discussion. But the work that I do has elements of art and elements of science, and I believe in plain language philosophy as much as possible, and I believe in writing about subjects that really, really matter to the lives of living people. But all that is sort of up in the air, and the idea with this series of video journals was to sort of relax and fill any breaks in time that I had to just talk about what I was working on at the time as much as I could, with allowing for keeping a lot of things under wraps. But as often happens, I got too much of a plan with it. So I want to talk in just a minute about why having a plan sometimes ruins things. Also about not being upset that things are ruined. And excuse me if I seem slightly distracted doing this, because I have very poor equipment for doing video recording. And it's a little laggy, frankly, but I'm doing my best, and just have patience with the fact that the video quality is not that great. All right, so the absolute first thing, though, I want to get to before I go off into the importance of creative failure and not being upset by it, and why it's instructive that having a plan is a way of spoiling things. First thing I want to say is that actually in the past year, something important happened with this project, which is that I started putting excerpts up online at my blog, which is hosted on WordPress, and its name is Wisdom Dancer. You should be able to find it by Googling, but I'll also put a link up. This was sort of an eclectic blog before, where I just wrote whatever the hell I wanted, but now really it hosts excerpts, and that's all I'm going to do with it probably for a while, with rare exceptions of posts about a couple other things. But I don't really believe in distracting myself with social media or posting about much else other than the work I do, because that takes up a lot of time and energy, and I consider it really important, so I try not to distract myself with too much else. So excerpts online, I've posted a handful so far, and it's really a very small amount. of the total of the constellation of man, and they're completely out of context. So don't even try to figure out how these fit together. They absolutely do not, because they're for completely different places. And actually, the area I'm writing these days, which is the second part of the second volume, the second book, capital B, of the second volume, continues from one of these excerpts, which is called, given the temporary title of Proteus and Begonia. And you can read that one in particular, and I might, if I have time today, I might talk about the subjects that introduces. For most of this year, I've been working on that part, so you can see the part that's basically finished out of the mess that I made trying to finish the rest. But so that in particular might be interesting if I get to talking about that, and I might not. But the other areas are from completely different parts of the 3 volumes. I hope you'll check those out. One of them is the first part of a 2-part section, which actually has no particular location for its home yet. But that one I might get a chance to continue soon, and I might not. The thing about these excerpts is they are some of the best freestanding parts I can put up that don't actually have a consistent, or rather don't plug into a context that you need to see all of to understand it. And I'm trying also not to ruin the experience of reading the whole thing in the end. It's meant to be kind of a big experience, so there are some really great parts that I can't put up unless I want to sort of ruin how things fit together. And those discoveries are a large part of why I'd write such a big, ambitious work of philosophy, and the sort of, aha experience and magical experience that I want people to get reading it, sort of spoiled, just like reading any great big work of literature and having the plot points and how things fit together sort of spoiled for you. It's not a continuous story or anything like that. It's just themes sort of fit together in a way that they get additive layers of meaning over time, and they come back and mean more, and things like that. So it's a feeling of getting more than the sum of the parts, really, to use a cliche, but it's very true. So there's a limited number of parts that I can really put online. First of all, that are finished enough to put online. Second of all, that are interesting in themselves. Third of all, they don't spoil what I'm trying to do with larger connections in the work. So, nonetheless, I hope you'll check out these excerpts, and they give a better sense of what I'm trying to do with the writing than I'll ever be able to get across in talking about doing writing. So anyway, with that out of the way, I hope you'll check this out, but I want to get to the importance of failure. Back to that. So I had a really good idea, I thought, this is sort of fits right into a major theme, which is when you have a very clear, excellent plan that you tell yourself you're going to do, often that's exactly where you go off the rails. Because you have these specific ambitions, and you're very organized, as they say, linear way of thinking about a logical way of doing something. You have a plan A to B to C, and that doesn't really necessarily happen for a host of reasons. I write a lot about how that doesn't happen because that's not all you are, and you don't just give instructions to your body and the rest of your mind and they follow it. It's not a top-down process where there's sort of a king or leader who gives orders and everybody else is just sort of like, they exist to serve. Your mind isn't like that, and you are not like that. So I make this mistake all the time of saying to myself, all right, I'm going to be able to execute this plan. And so creatively speaking, it's often a terrible thing to have a very specific plan so that you can't innovate, you can't have that much fun sort of filling it out. You just have a sort of a bullet point plan to go through, and I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this, and it's not spontaneous, and it ceases to be interesting after a little bit. So the original idea with these journals was to just talk, and that makes them a lot easier for me to do because I need to not distract myself with production quality, as you can tell, or scripts or anything like that. And I can't read from a teleprompter anyway, so it doesn't really help. I have no particular skills whatsoever for doing videos, and so this is just a journal about what it's like to essentially apply the highest level of work that I can do to writing philosophy, thinking of it as a creative artist trying to make the highest literature that they can, in addition to trying to address the most important themes, topics that they possibly can, and also applying a level of critical care that you probably would only see in science otherwise. So I have to be, that's a very Nietzschean concept of what philosophy is, but of course it's very boring to say I have these topics to go through, and that's an example of sort of, I have this very explicit plan. What really makes great literature is, of course, something totally different, feeling of surprise, of serendipity, but also of something very different from a thematic organization. So what I wanted to do pretty quickly with these journals was to do something that wasn't spontaneous, and that was that I got this great idea for how I wanted to talk about a specific subject in my second video. And so about a year ago I made all these great notes, these wonderful bullet points, and they were very intricate and impossible to read from while doing one of these. So it would have had me going like this all the time, and that's just awful. So I didn't do that, thankfully. But it left me sort of upset that this wasn't going to happen for a while, and it's because I really wanted to talk about it, and it's just far too intricate to do. The subject that I wanted to do was the ways in which I wanted to, or I continue to want to do different kind of educational literature. So I guess I'll talk very, very briefly about what that was going to be about, which is nothing to do with formal education, but the ways in which that I'm trying to write about sort of remedial themes that I think are nonetheless really, really important, but most of all, education in the sense of how to think rather than what to think. Yes, there are, I think, big gaps in things that people know that they ought to know, especially human nature, which is, you could say, one of the biggest specific areas of interest and areas that I write about. But it's less about specific themes of knowledge than how to think well and how to think differently, and sort of inspiring people to think not just in specific techniques, but in sort of getting the feeling and the flavor of how to think differently. And I had all these examples of this, and so what I will say about it is that the most important thing for me is to demonstrate in the way I write and draw people into thinking more and differently about subjects than they're used to. And if I do it right, it doesn't announce itself as educational so much as I'm talking about things in a way that promotes thoughtfulness and thinking about things in many, many different ways. And so I was going to talk about all the different techniques that I use for this, and had some cool things to talk about. Unfortunately, it was 2 pages of notes, and they were intricate, as my notes usually are, and they were not wasn't a script that I could read, and I can't do that anyway. So basically scrapped it, and the problem, looking back on it later, it's really a microcosm of how I get into a creative scrape, oftentimes by sort of, and actually this mistake happens over and over and over to me. I get a plan of writing according to a subject, a theme, and I start going into it systematically. And this is exactly what I'm trying not to do. It's basically writing an essay about a specific subject. In this project, I'm really trying to write according to a completely different organizational theme. Now, in the Constellation of Man, there are so many different topics. There are almost an infinite number of ways I can organize what I'm doing, and this is one of the biggest challenges, because if you put it, in a specific order, that means that the next piece falls out a different way. And it's basically sort of saying, all right, what if I try this first, then this first, then I think this should go first, then I have to try it in a different order and see if that works better. So it's sort of like arranging puzzle pieces, and each one makes a determination about what the next one is going to have to be like, unless I want it to be extremely disjointed. So partially, one way I default to organizing this, could be in any order problem, is to say, all right, let's systematically go through, and then by subject, and sort of it ends up being essay 1, essay 2, essay 3, and it uses previous subjects in each subsequent essay. And that's exactly boring. I mean, it's exactly the worst thing to do, because it's a systematic tour through all the most important subjects I want to write about. It's a series of essays, and I've done that before, and I don't want to do it again. All the better stuff that I think I've ever written, I mean, not that I've systematically written everything I want to write, it's not true, but I've collected parts of essays on almost everything I've ever wanted to write about. I just find that doesn't really achieve the goals of what I want to achieve in the reader, which is that they see the significance of why you'd write about these things, and they also can think about the idea is that they can think about them themselves further, understanding them a bit better and knowing how to think about them better. So you want to achieve an effect in the reader, and the way to do that is not to write essays generally. In limited cases, I think that a thematic or an organizational method that uses subjects works okay, especially if you have a very short area of interest, a very specific area of interest. I mean, reading an essay is hardly the worst thing in the world, especially if it's well written. Take, for example, Orwell writing about politics in the English language. I think that's a great essay. It's one of my favorites. But he has a very delimited scope that he's interested in. Imagine if you had to read 100 such essays in a row, and I think just get bored by the enterprise, or there would be no overarching sort of power of those disconnected subjects. So I'm trying to create a work of scope that where each part comes together and inspires and educates and improves lives on the basis of reading the whole thing, and reading multiple parts. And when you're talking about that, you're talking about literature that is sort of like mythology, that it's not just about specific stories, it's about how they enrich your life and get you to think differently by the end of it. I mean, if you make yourself familiar with a mythos or with any comprehensive work of literature, you're really changed by it. And it's not necessarily a specific passage. It's sort of, for example, the way a symbol picks up meaning along the way. And, also the way that it affects the way that you feel and think, so that by the end of it, maybe you have a completely different manner in mind from how you came into the manner or style of thinking that peacefulness, for example, or meditative quality that writing can have. Or writing can put you in all kinds of different states of mind, depending on how it's written. There are, more techniques in writing literature than in an artistic sense than I can go into, but the idea is to leverage those in exactly the same way, but in writing about prose. But the important thing that I figure is maybe the most essential, one of the most essential insights for writing the Constellation of Man for me is to stop grabbing subjects and say, all right, I want to systematically go through this, because it's an essay writer's instinct. But in terms of an educational process, changing the person who's reading it, I think it's one of the weakest styles to use. If you take the people who like poetry and the way they're changed by it, or the people who like novels or short stories, or mythology, or evocative themes that are based on, let's say, what Jung called archetypes or symbolism, but in connotation as well as sort of what it represents. These are sort of resonant themes that have a power beyond what they even seem to symbolize or mean. You could say, all right, what does this dream mean? Well, you can apply some form of analysis to it, but you'll get a very dry version, completely different from the way it made you feel. And the same in reading great literature that uses sort of evocative themes rather than subject-based organization. There's a reception that you get emotionally and physically, which is much greater than the denotation of words. And my attempt is to sort of achieve evocative writing through actually organizing all of the writing, or as much as possible, by inspirational or evocative themes. I'll take an example that I don't actually use, but you get a sort of unconscious sense of the word sun, or sun god, or any of those sorts of compacted and interlaced meanings in mythology. You get a sort of unconscious resonance from all the cultural attachments we have to either sun or the sun god's role in mythology, and it's very, very much more than what it's supposed to mean, what's very specifically meaning. There's a sort of almost like echoing effect in any. We're familiar with so many cultural echoes of a god looking down and light, and it's attached to all kinds of references. So if someone uses, and actually I did this in the novel I wrote, Pyramid of Babel, there's a sense of an eye looking down at you, or a god looking down at you in the sun. For me, because I'm light sensitive, it means something a little different, but historically this is incredibly important, obviously, but not just in a strict scientific way, and in a number of ways that people really aren't even sure of. But why is that? Why might you dream about all kinds of things referenced by dreaming about the sun or about, say, Helios or something like that. I mean, Jung's explanation was collective unconscious, but I mean, think of it in terms of culture over a long period of time, laying down all kinds of nuances and meanings, all of which you might be familiar with just from living in Western culture or just on planet Earth. It's impossible not to have associations with the concepts of surrounding, gods or solar deities or the sun in the sky. It has all these literature references and religious references and so forth. So it's sort of like culture has done this work of laying down these layers of meaning and significance and feelings about it that could connect to anything from feelings about your father unconsciously to feelings about authority or all kinds of things. And that so much of that work is done in cultural references that literature can just sort of use these things and in drawing upon a well-known sort of symbol or archetype, it can access all this stuff. So it's sort of a cheat to significance, if you like, that you use references to the Bible or something like that, or anything that's present in any mythology when you're writing literature, because you get to draw on these layers that many other people have already created for you, and you just add your own, and it seems very profound and deep beyond what you actually wrote, if you do it right. And so, getting back to the Constellation of Man, and my attempt to write philosophy very, very differently from boring philosophy, it's to organize a great number of subjects, primarily according to the inspiration of imagery, and what Jung called archetypes, and what a lot of people would call symbols in writing, and to draw on a lot of unconscious stuff. The problem, of course, is if I use exclusively imagery, symbols, and make these, sort of meditative avenues of organizing the material I have in mind to write about. There's an organizational premise there that's achieved that's very interesting. I basically suggest an image that's powerful, and it can allow me to talk about this and that and the other thing that it attaches to, and it brings a new perspective on things, and that's great. But there's a real problem that there's a shortage of these images that are available that people already know and consider powerful. And if I'm using them in similar ways, especially to the ways they've already been used, then I'm sort of recycling old philosophy and old meaning, and I want people to think differently about plenty of things, and also to think on their own. So, for example, if I'm dredging the Bible or Greek mythology or anything else too much, it's I have to consider that I'm causing people to think probably in much the same ways that people already have, or at least I could be. I mean, there's a certain amount I can get from synthesis of different cultures, but basically I need to think up a whole lot of new symbols or new uses for old ones, so that I can talk very, very about very new things, or I can get across really different ideas in this powerful way, and not just have people draw the same lessons and think the same ways as previous stories, basically. So the challenge is really quite great, that I need to invent a new mythos, basically, that's capable of talking in a very sophisticated way about sometimes very modern topics, modern society and its challenges and all of that sort of stuff, but also human nature and reconsidering it, and topics as modern as current anthropological insights need to be injected. And to a certain extent, I can fill that out in a sort of essay-like manner, but I have to really watch myself, because I'll get into following a plan that's very topically organized and far too specific. And frankly, what works best is to sort of ramble, allow the writing to ramble a little bit and see what happens. And sometimes it just turns into a ramble that, then I need to edit quite a bit. But sometimes it gets into playing with imagery and ideas, and it's playing with images and where they take me that needs to be the main organizational premise, and not, for example, talking about human nature. That's the main overarching topic, if you will, of the book that I'm working on now, of the section of the second volume that I'm working on now, and I screwed up repeatedly on it, actually, by trying to sort of systematically go through the topics about human nature that I wanted to go through, sort of, for example, negativity towards it, and so forth. But that's not, to have a section or two that's about, the ways in which people are extremely negative or self-doubting about human worth is potentially very dry and not very arresting. So an example of an arresting image is talking about ways of symbolizing scary aspects in human nature or doubt that are, for example, vampires are a sort of a stupid example, but there's a little bit of talking about how horror tropes are potentially originally ways of dealing with fear or anxiety over instinctual appetites. And that's a part of human nature that people have always grappled with, the ways in which they're animals on some level, literally hungry or bestial in some other way, violent, or these go right to the core of doubts about human nature. But it's much more powerful to talk about that in a vivid way, evoking sort of a symbol that can sort of encapsulate this if you do it right. One way to do that is to talk about very specific cultural things like horror tropes and the legends that they come from and what that might mean. But another sort of overarching symbol for our feelings about human nature is the human face, and that's an example of making something interesting that would be boring, using writing about the human face as a sort of gateway to feeling negative or feeling afraid of human nature. And human face is a sort of an endlessly interesting thing to most people, and they don't even really necessarily think about it. But it's how we read emotions, and it's sort of a synecdoche of feelings towards ourselves and feelings towards other people, and so that's been somewhat successful using that, and I'm actually talking about work I'm really in the middle of, so I can't say it was definitely successful, but writing about the human face and all kinds of different spins on that as a way of organizing a whole section of material is kind of obviously more arresting than Human Nature Part 1, 2, 3. It's sort of focusing on thematic topics, subjects as a way of organizing writing, and getting into sort of details, rather than finding an arresting image and that sort of organizes the stuff for you if you do it right. That's sort of the premise, is that on an unconscious level we have these sort of grasping images. The name I gave to these in writing about them elsewhere in the Constellation of Man is a nexus. But the concept that I have is somewhat different from an archetype, really, in that I think that this is an organizational tool that our brains use to grasp too much material. And I want to write to that. I want to use that theory in writing in not only powerful ways, but also, I think, more effective ways for grasping a lot of material. Sort of sense of getting a grasp on material that you can understand better as a result of having an organizational image, if you will. The face can be made to connect to a great many things, and sort of like a key to gain purchase on a whole lot of different material. And I think that's something that dreams give a bit of an insight to, in the way that they can problem solve. And you can sort of see your way through, a Gordian knot of material, of information that you could never figure out in a systematic way. There's a propensity that our minds have for sort of figuring out intricate information on the basis of some nexus that will grasp, connect to very many different things at the same time. Simultaneously connecting to things is the ability that we have when we're dreaming sometimes, and also when we're being creative. It's a sort of hyper-connective ability, which is immensely useful for problem solving. And having a plan, similarly, is how we get into the situation of saying, I don't know how to solve this, because I'm saying, all right, I'm going to do this, this, and this, and it's going to fall into place. And it's sort of giving directions for solving rather than actually getting the inspiration for it. And I'm talking about how the inspiration happens. But when I'm talking about my problem of organizing a lot of disparate information, which could connect any number of ways, it just turns into an absolute soup of ideas if I'm not careful. Or just a list, or a linear journey when in fact it should all be branching and connecting somehow. But how does that happen? It happens through these things that feel significant to us. And if I don't have them, if they're not ready-made by the culture that I already know, I have to invent them. It's basically the idea. So to get back to making a mistake, the second installment of doing a video journal was supposed to be about a subject, education or writing, or the sense in which I'm doing educational literature in a new way, and teaching people to think and that sort of thing. So that's an example of a subject, when in fact it was a overly directed thing to be doing that caused me to have to essentially make a big list of things to go through, and it probably wouldn't have made the best video of me going through A and then B and then C. So that was almost sort of, probably a good way to do a speech, but not a good way to grasp, way more than I can really talk about. So I thought, in a weird little way, that was a perfect example of the larger problem in doing this work, which is that I run into, which is I want to start organizing things in the wrong way, and I need to constantly remind myself to let things happen and let suggestive and pregnant imagery do its work, and get into a creative mode rather than a systematic mode of organizing all the stuff that I need to write about. And it's easy to say, I need to write about this, I need to write about that, and just say, okay, pick an order and I'll systematically go through it. But that's really, let's say, more of a critical scientific way of writing. And in the Nietzschean way of approaching writing philosophy, it's extremely important for things to be well written, but it's also extremely important for them to be inspired and evocative. Nietzsche in writing was as much of an artist as a critical thinker, and that's one of the reasons for his eventual popularity, and the ways in which he was inspiring as well. And I'm really trying to work in that tradition. But anyway, the other important point to make about failing is sort of maybe just useful for creative work in general, for people doing art completely unlike what I'm doing, which is getting comfortable with failure. And it's sort of self-helpy to say you know things like you fail until you succeed and all that crap. But it is true that if you're doing anything creative or artistic at really the cutting edge of what you can do, and what I'm trying to do is immensely difficult and often beyond me. So it's a great example of pushing yourself to do a project that's extremely challenging, and I really wish more artists, more writers in particular, would push themselves a lot harder. But anytime you're pushing yourself really, really hard and trying to do something that's incredibly ambitious, and maybe you can't do, maybe it's impossible. That's the sort of stuff that interests me, by the way. Sometimes, inevitably, when you're at the cutting edge or at the very limit of what your powers are, especially even over time, giving yourself lots and lots of time to do something, you'll generate failures. You will fail to do things as you planned. So you'll end up with lots of, as a writer, you end up littering your, collections of material with junk, or with stuff you don't want to publish and it didn't work out, or you have part of it or something like that. I have a lot of partial successes, but I also have I've collected a lot of failures. And I think anyone who works on things that are really ambitious as a creative person, you have to get sort of, I don't want to say comfortable, because that's wrong. I get very uncomfortable with this, and it stimulates me to solve the problem that in a different way, which is how I get to successes. But so the idea is to fail and not like it at all, really. But in a larger sense, you need to be comfortable with yourself failing and not kill yourself for it and not give up. If you set yourself a very high, ambitious bar to reach, you will usually fail. And eventually you might actually succeed, but only if you're not comfortable with failing and staying there and giving up. And only if you take it as a stimulus to try something different. You might have to adjust that goal till it's something, I don't want to say less ambitious, but something different that you can do. And the self-helpy part is learning from your failures, absolutely. And readapt those failures as much as possible. And in the specific case of writing 2, pages of detailed notes about, how I intend to write educationally in a very different sense from the ways you might think of the word. I now have useful stuff to inspire and guide me and to re-clarify things for myself at times, and I can turn that into more material. And I just don't have a video that I plan to do, and sort of, I wish I immediately always said, big deal, I sunk a lot of time into something and I don't care. I wish I could, be that resilient that I immediately said, all right, I'm ready to try something different now, and I'm fine with that. But actually, it's really upsetting to me because I'm just as human as plenty of other people, and I hate to fail, and it's frustrating. But with the priorities that I had, obviously, I cared more about putting time into doing writing than talking about it. So whether it's editing excerpts or doing videos, like I probably could have figured out a different way of doing it if I wanted to put a lot of attention into it. But in the end, getting stuck on that plan was not productive, and if I'd sunk all the time and energy necessary to figure out how to do a non-boring video of going through all those points systematically, I might have figured it out, but then I would have adhered to a plan, and I would have wasted a lot of energy. And I think plans cause us sometimes to be good at fulfilling the plan and not good at fulfilling the larger plan, the larger intent, the larger goals that we have, because we get stuck on this. I have a system that I want to fulfill. A systematic way of thinking gets us into this. I have a system I want to fulfill, and that becomes more important than the larger goal, which is, in the end, the work that you want to deliver that's as special as you can make it. And so I think it's important to be very clear about the goals that you have as a creative person, and not attached to a specific way of doing it. And that's usually where you'll fail, actually. It's, this specific plan I have, this specific method for getting there that I get so attached to, will be impossible for some reason. And you'll say, God damn it, and that it doesn't feel good to not be able to do something or not be good enough at doing something, or to have, one of the reasons it's hard for me to just read words while I talk is that I have a visual disability now, which I've had since 2011, and that's immensely frustrating at times. But everyone has their, I wasn't good enough feeling, that, or I'm not able to do something feeling, and it's never good. And you wish all your directives and plans directives that you give yourself and plans that you have for the ways you want to, achieve creative output, or really anything you're trying to do. You have a plan for it, and when that goes wrong, it feels bad. So some people, they make plans about pretty simple things, and then they feel good because they can obviously do them. But we're talking about doing something that's really ambitious, and that means that you figure out a way you want to do it, and probably it won't work. And the thing to have in mind is that is part of the process. It is not and this is in danger of being self-helpy again, but it's not a straight line. The way that you manage to figure out actual ways to do amazing stuff is to try and to learn from the fact that you won't be getting there through a direct route. Because if it were easy to do, you probably wouldn't be compelled to do it, and it probably wouldn't be important to do. And in many cases, someone would already have done it, and you would be doing something non-original. So if you're trying to create something really different, something really important, to manage some feat that no one has before, something that needs doing, for example, which I hope is the case with what I'm doing, it probably was really hard to achieve. It's probably very, very difficult to achieve. So that means there wasn't a direct route, or else someone else would have done it, and probably a lot by now. So you have to invent sort of scaffolding to be able to paint the Sistine Chapel. And maybe if you take a stab at inventing scaffolding, that hadn't been, if that hadn't been done before, you would do something that fell down long before you figured out how to do it in the right way. And a lot of what I've been doing is figuring out methods for how to do things, because what I'm trying to do is really unusual with the Constellation of Man. So there's all kinds of, but wait, this doesn't work at all sensations. And one thing I want to get across in this video is that sometimes we get stuck on a way of doing something creatively, which is just a dumb idea. But you know, there's no perfect way to know that in advance. And try to relax and not hammer away at getting the method to happen that you first had in mind, and you're going to feel that's a failure at first, but in fact it's a way of learning something, and it's a way of sometimes collecting, in my case, written material, but in another case, you know, if you had a way of, say, painting something differently and it failed, you'd have a study on how to do it, rather than a botched canvas. You know, try to think of whatever you're doing in your particular goal or medium as practice, as a study, as a part of the learning process that's calcified and expressed in this particular thing you did. And all these steps are not part of a straight line journey, but they are forays towards eventually figuring out how to do these ambitious things that you might have in mind. That's assuming that you do have ambitious goals and you are a creative person and watching this, but those are the people I'm most interested in talking to in these videos, really, because I want to make life easier for other people who have big, important goals. And that's the thing I have, honestly, the most sympathy with among artists. And I think I see too little of that, specifically in writing. And if nothing else with these videos, I'd like to inspire more people to write with more ambition, and to think about the creative process with more ambition, and a little specific insight into all the things I've learned and I'm still learning about writing philosophy, I think would be a nice step, given that most philosophy is incredibly boring to read and often remarkably trivial for being about purportedly important things. I think that goes for a lot of writing about psychology too, unfortunately, although I think it's not as bad off, but academia in general, I think, has sort of spoiled the art of writing philosophy horribly. It already had done so to a large extent when Nietzsche sort of upended things with his way of doing things. But of course, long ago, there was no great divide between doing philosophy, actually doing philosophy, thinking, and writing philosophy, and anything else. There was no specific discipline in academic terms called philosophy that was separate from doing other things. So philosophers were also other things, and that probably improved the way that they expressed themselves enormously and the way that they thought enormously. But then we got academic philosophy, which is, well, boring and formal, and it's actually in many ways a history of a canon of philosophy, rather than actually doing it. And so when Nietzsche in the 19th century approached it like writing literature again, more like ancient philosophers, and thinking in an inclusive way that drew upon everything, and eschewed formality and boring writing as well. he really brought a lot of fresh air in, and that's one of the things that inspired me to write philosophy about very, very important things, critical things, as literature that would inspire people and show them how to think in different ways, with more, for example, with more reflection, rather than just sort of dryly talking about it. And this is a great question of this canon writer of philosophy, and you might be talking about the very same thing on occasion, but if you find a more interesting way to talk about it, it comes alive for people, for the reader and the thinker in their own way, rather than just, this is what so-and-so says about this question. So the hope is to evoke an inspired process, actually a creative process in the reader of philosophy. So I hope I've inspired people to fail a bit more pleasantly, or to remember the value in failing creatively, to fulfill your plans, and to just give up on certain ways of doing things that you're stuck on, but don't give up on the goals that you have creatively. And if anyone writing their own philosophy is reading this, the goals of talking about the ideas, the goals of being persuasive, or about viewpoints included, but the goals of thinking about ideas that you have, thinking about ideas through writing. Don't give up on those goals. Give up on bad ways of expressing them. Give up on bad ways of thinking about them. Give up on specific ways of achieving these goals. But don't lose sight of the more important goals. What I really want to do. How do I really want to inspire thought? What ideas do I really want to explore? And is the way I'm doing things really getting in the way of that? So I hope I've helped a little bit to remind you that failure is okay, even though it doesn't feel okay, and that it's important that it not feel okay, or not be comfortable parked at failure. It's part of what makes ambitious people succeed is not to be comfortable saying, all right, I give up. But definitely be comfortable letting your failures go extinct as what they were, but take them in a new direction, and without losing sight of what you really, really want to do, which is never just to follow a specific plan for doing something. It's to achieve something great. And as a creative method, the one that really never fails is to let yourself be free and play and think in innovative ways that come from loosening up and giving fewer directions to yourself. And that pretty much is never a failure, because it doesn't have a sense of failure. So I think that I've talked about enough for today. I talked about a minor example of failure, and how it can still be something useful. But I'll probably talk, if I do any more of these, I'll probably talk about making that same mistake again that I was comparing it to, with organizing by theme, organizing by subject, getting into writing essays, getting into organizing material in a non-inspired way, in a non-organic way, in a less evocative way than I possibly could. I'm definitely going to talk about this more, so if you're wondering why I don't give lots of examples, it's because, I have dozens and dozens and dozens of examples. And as I get into hands-on writing anything, I'll probably be able to talk about many of them in the future. But I wanted to introduce you a bit to how I'm trying to organize ideas very, very differently in the Constellation of Man, and trying to create some very interesting reading, but highly evocative writing about very, very important ideas instead of important subjects. Letting the ideas follow the imagery that can best carry it. And once again, the other thing I mentioned, that I have excerpts to read online for the first time from Constellation of Man. Once again, that's at my blog, Wisdom Dancer, and I'll put the link for that up, but I hope you will check those out. I haven't put one up since spring because I've been working pretty hard on talking about human nature without talking about human nature. Trying not to let that concept guide writing is a totally counterintuitive thing in some ways. So very hard work on a whole lot of writing since spring, and so I haven't really had time to edit more sections and get them cleaned up enough to put them online. But I think pretty soon I'll be able to do that with a section which is about illusions of the grand kind. So there's some discussion of social beliefs and political beliefs, which I haven't gotten into too much in previous excerpts, but I think that's going to be pretty definitely the next excerpt I put up. So maybe if I get that up soon, which I think I should be able to do, if I take a break in actual writing, maybe I'll talk about that in a video next time. It's kind of an interesting story, but until then, bye.